ILO 35. So we've played e4, but let's actually play d... Okay, let's not play d4. That was such a powerful move that the game was aborted. You know, somebody in YouTube asked me to play d4 and talk a little bit about how to play d4 systems. So we might try something like the London system, which I know is not everybody's cup of tea. But I'm sensitive to the fact that people play different openings. Okay, let's hope that this is a little bit better. I'm going to play the London system here, and I'm going to try to... Okay, I guess I'm not going to play the London. He plays c5. So that's the Benoni. And after the game, I'll explain what happens if you take the pawn. But normally in the Benoni, you want to advance the pawn to d5. Thank you, Reinhardt, for the prime. And he plays the move b5. It's a weird system. And when you play d4 openings, the basic opening principles remain exactly the same as when you play e4 openings. So when our opponent plays on the flank like this, what should we do? How should we respond? Should we imitate him and play on the flank as well, or should we play in the center? We should play in, of course, the center. And what should we do? We should play e4. And immediately we pose a threat to the pawn, which he defends. Now, one of the key concepts in d4 openings is that the positional elements of the game usually come out a little bit sooner. And one of the things that I want to do is I want this c4 square for either my bishop or my knight. You guys can see that this bishop is a little bit cramped. I can't really develop it. So how can we go about, and I call this concept carving out. We can play the move a4. You'll see this move very often in these types of openings. And the idea is not mysterious. We are carving out the c4 square so that our bishop can get more active. Potentially this knight can also maneuver itself to c4. Very typical idea in the Benoni. For now, let's just keep developing our pieces. And no joke, thank you for the sub. Okay, so now we're just developing our pieces. And one good idea in such positions is also to prevent him from going a5 and buttressing this pawn on b4. How can we go about doing that? Thank you, Reinhardt, 13 for the 5 gifted. Appreciate it. How can we stop him from going a4? Well, obviously we can play a5 ourselves. So isn't this pawn going to be weak, you may ask? No, it's not, because the rook defends it. And if you think about it, he has no way to increase the pressure on this pawn. Now, we can't get our bishop out, right? Hope that makes sense to everybody. Because he takes on b2. We don't want to give away a pawn for free. So how can we blunt his bishop so that our bishop may have a path toward development? Thank you, Weil Snipers. Yeah, we can just play c3. So that now we can develop our bishop. And as a bonus, if he takes on c3, well, guess what? Our knight is going to have a nice development square on c3. 100 bits, thank you. So he's probably going to go he's probably going to go knight f6 and attack the pawn on e4. He's having some internet problems. Man, my moves are so strong that they're literally causing my opponent's internet to just disconnect. So let's defend this pawn. Now, there's a couple of ways to do that. Thank you guys for the sub. We can go knight bd2, right? But the drawback of that would be that our bishop would then not be able to develop itself. So let's defend the pawn with a rook so that our bishop can then move out, and then we'll be able to develop our knight to d2, and everything will be nicely developed. Yeah, this looks like some internet issues. Okay, obviously we're going to go bishop g5. We're going to go to the most active square. f4 would also have been possible. Again, I emphasize this point a lot. Sometimes there's more than one good square for a piece. You shouldn't think of it like, oh, every one of my pieces needs to be, figuring out a way to distribute the COVID vaccine. Like, no, sometimes pieces can be in a mediocre spot, and that's okay, as long as there's other pieces that are doing the heavy lifting. Okay, so knight e8. Now, what strikes me about this move, what does he want? What he wants is to prevent my knight from coming out to d2. Why does he prevent my knight from coming to d2? Because if you notice, he's got two attackers on the c3 pawn. He's going to win that pawn. So let's preemptively defend the c3 pawn so that we can get our knight out. How can we can do that in several different ways. One good way of doing that is to bring our queen out to c2, which also has the positive effect of reinforcing the pawn on e4. He goes f6. Very strange play, very passive, but that's not going to stop us from adhering to our main strategy. He's probably going to go h5. I think that's what he wants, if I'm getting the right read. No, knight c7. Okay, so how do we respond when our opponent plays this passively? And I've mentioned this many times before. When our opponent plays passively, what is the main thing that we have to do in order to expose, or better expose, I would say the poverty of his development. We should open the center as much as we can. Now we can't go e5 because that that square is perfectly protected, but we can take on b4. Now you guys might look at this and, well, wait a second, you're not really opening the center, but I'm opening something. I'm opening the c file, and by trading pawns, whenever pawns are traded, even on the side of the board, what you need to do is look at which squares are now made available to your pieces. Which previously defended squares can we now take up with our pieces? And as you guys are pointing out, we can put our knight in the center. Where is this knight going? Several possibilities. Look at this beautiful outpost. Look at this beautiful outpost. Thank you, the real Black Stallion. Beautiful squares that the knight can access. All of our pieces are nicely developed. We can also bring the rook into the game with rook c1. Remember that the c file has been opened. Either square is good. It depends on what he does. If he goes bishop b7, well, then we can still put our knight on c6. Yeah, I think you guys are taking a fancy to knight. Now, I don't like the fact that this knight is on c5. Can we get this knight out of here? Can we trade it? That knight is his only active piece. And oftentimes, you want to search for your opponent's only active piece. I know that some of you guys are wondering why I didn't take the pawn. I'll explain that after the game. Thank you, Zelorian, for the prime. 1 sec. And I'm noting stuff down to not forget. Why not knight takes b4? So we're trying to trade his only active piece. Our knight remains on a beautiful outpost. If he takes, what are we going to take back with? I mean, and both pieces are fine, but remember that the c file has been opened. So our queen is actually very nicely positioned, which means that we can take with our bishop and we can open up that c file for our queen. This creates potential for discovered attacks against this knight on c7. Remember that this knight on c7 is unprotected. So we should be watch. Okay, so he wants to trap our bishop. Let's prevent him from doing that before we do anything else. Thank you, Mako, with a tier 2. Oh, that's what we're talking about. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, okay, great. I don't care. And the reason I'm so dismissive about this, which you shouldn't be about your opponent's ideas, is because he has no pieces in the attack. So there's no way this is going to work. Okay, so let's continue bringing our pieces into the game. Let's bring our rook. Well, we can bring it on. Well, let's get it on c1. Let's bring our rook into the game. Exit. Thank you, Scrammy Dangles. Thank you guys for all this incredible support. And I'll thank people properly after the game. As you can see, my time is running a little bit short, so at some point I might have to accelerate the pace in my play. So right now we're bringing all of our pieces into the game, and let's get our queen to a more central location so that if he plays rook c8, we don't have to worry about the fact that he pins our queen, and we can finally then come around and take this pawn on b4. Why are we not afraid of him taking the knight? I will explain that. Well, I'll explain that in the game. What should we take back with? What should we take back with? This is a pretty instructive moment. A case could be made for both pieces. But we're going to take with a pawn because look at this pawn. It's very far advanced. We also open up the bishop's diagonal toward his king. And where can we plant this bishop? We can plant it all the way on e6. What does this move accomplish? Well, for one thing, it just freezes his pieces. And for another thing, it covers the c8 square. Why is this square important? Because that's the square from which he can stop the progress of our pawn. So we're literally threatening to promote this pawn, which is quite rare for a middle game, but now we're going to slam this bishop onto d7. He's done a good job of blockading the pawn, but now his knight is super passive. So, so what should we do in a scenario like this when his pieces are incredibly passive, but we can't quite find the crushing blow? Well, what's the sort of typical prescription that I always offer in these situations? We should open up the position a little bit more. Can we open up the position a little bit more? We shouldn't sack on d6. That would be a little bit overzealous, but we can play the move f4. Now, I know you guys are looking at this move and saying, but wait a minute, aren't you opening up a direct line of fire toward my king? And the answer to that is yes, I am. But on the other hand, I'm also, you know, everything here is reciprocal because his king is also on this side of the board. So what my judgment tells me is that because my pieces are so much better placed, I'm going to be better equipped to handle the opening of the position than he is. If he puts a rook on g8, okay, big deal. I'm just going to defend the pawn on g2, so there's no shenanigans with a discovered attack. But after that, his pawn on h4 becomes weak. He goes bishop h6, so he's not playing badly. Now, I'm not going to take on h6. Let's trade on my own terms. I'm going to go rook f1, so that if he takes my bishop, the rook comes into the game, and guess what? That h4 pawn is going to be in big trouble. He keeps on disconnecting. I think that's pretty much hurting his chances. Yeah, rook takes f4. Okay, what should we do now? We have a winning sequence. Can somebody spot the entire thing? Thank you, channel, for the 500 bits. So first we do what? First we collect the harvest. Do not take this pawn. He's trying to trick us. First we take h4. His king has to move. And after his king moves, as you guys are correctly pointing out, good job, rook g4, pins his queen to his king. There we go. You see what happens? We open up the position. He's not ready for it. He doesn't have the pieces to defend against it. And okay, he's going to lose on time, but just to show everybody, king g7, rook g4 is a typical pin. The rook is defended, and we win his queen. So let's go over the game briefly. Although I think everything was relatively clear, there's a couple of moments to point out. The move c5 is called the old Benoni defense. And a lot of you may be wondering why is this not a free pawn? Well, there's a complicated reason for this. Black can win it back immediately with queen a5. But that's not actually what most people do here, because that brings the queen out early. You don't necessarily want to do that. Normally, I think the black plays e6 here and tries to take back the pawn with his bishop. And if we stubbornly try to defend this pawn, and I'm just verifying this, yes. So how should black proceed in this position? We have a pawn chain. You guys already know the principle. I've shared it many times. We attack the base of the pawn chain. And when we have softened up the base of the pawn chain, then we attack the tip. Odd attack, thank you for the prime. Because the base is weak, we can take the base and then we can take the tip. Black has a great center. Black has a great position. So clinging to the pawn is not a good prescription for this position. That's why we go d5 and claim more of the center. We also prevent his knight from developing to its natural square. b5 is, I'm sure, a move. I've not really seen this before. And we responded by occupying more of the center. Now we do this carving out mechanism. And let me just pop open ChessBase, if you guys don't mind, for a second. And I want to show a very typical application of this concept. I know it's a little bit boring to some of you, but I believe this is very important. This concept of carving out. Where does it manifest itself in real games? Can you, like, I get it, Daniel, you're doing it in this game. Can you show me a grandmaster game where this happens? I absolutely can. And you guys will just have to give me a second to find one. Because I didn't have it prepared. That's part of the fun of the speedrun. I never know which concepts are going to be, I'm going to be able to illustrate. But here's a good example from a game over 100 years ago, which black did not end up winning, but he did apply the concept. So Tarash against Duras. So the concept of carving out or undermining is a concept where your opponent has a pawn. That pawn is on a particular square, and it's covering a square where you really want to put one of your pieces. You have a piece, you want to put it on a square, your opponent has a pawn that's covering that square. What do? Well, you use one of your pawns to undermine or literally take that pawn which is covering the square you want to get to. Channel No 5, thank you for the prime. So this was 1912, two of the leading players of the day. What did black do in this position? Which square do we want to access? How do we carve that square out? b5 is correct. So if we think about this knight on f6, right? The knight doesn't have any good squares. It doesn't have many prospects because every square that it could potentially go to is covered by one of white's pieces. So Duras plays b5, carving out the d5 square for his knight. Tarash advances. Duras drops his bishop back, and look at how beautiful this outpost on d5 is. Unassailable knight. And the game ended in a draw. Black was not able to win, but he was better. And Tarash did something super clever here. Tarash was like, whoa, 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 not on my watch. That knight on d5, it looks unassailable, but I'm going to assail it. So what do you think Tarash did here to try to trade this knight on d5? Carson, thank you for the prime. And I'll explain what happens if white plays b3. So, yeah, knight a2. Now, he doesn't move the other knight because his other knight is already on an outpost. So, and this is actually something that you want to do, right? When you're trying to accomplish a task on the chessboard, and there are several pieces to do it with, you want to make sure that you're using the piece that's most passive so that you don't accidentally dislodge a piece that's already on a good square. And now we get the knight to c3. Welcome, Charlotte Chess Center. And yeah, so now we get the knight to c3, and he trades the knight. And unfortunately, Duras has to take it. So the game ends in a draw. Now, if white had gone b3 in this position, then I think he was afraid of his king getting opened up. So something like this would have happened. And then he gets his queen to b4. This just doesn't look particularly appetizing for white at all. So that's, in a nutshell, the concept of carving out. That's what we did in my game. Okay. So that's what we did in my game. And now we get the bishop to c4. So it's the same concept. It's a different piece. And basically now we continue our development. Okay, now we go a5 to stop him from coming a5 himself. Now we go c3 to be able to develop this bishop. And now we go bishop g5, x blank 4. Thank you for the prime. And basically everything we do here is in order to be able to develop other pieces. So here we can't move our knight out because we're going to blunder the pawn. And here, that's why we play queen c2. Okay. So now we take on b4 in order to open up the center. I'm going to skip right to an important moment. Why didn't we take on b4? Wasn't this just a free pawn that we could have captured with our knight? And the answer really is yes, it was. But sometimes your piece is so well placed that you don't actually want to move it away from its outpost, even for a knight. Even for a pawn. For a knight, you would totally move the knight from c6. I hope that concept makes sense. It's not all about material. Sometimes a piece is so active that you want to keep it on a square at all costs, and I didn't want to get waylaid by this pawn. I thought this pawn isn't going anywhere. So that's why we tried to trade his strongest piece instead. Okay, so h5, h3, and the rest was very straightforward. You get a rook to a good square. So why not h4 here instead? Yeah, we could have gone h4, but I was a little bit worried about weakening my king before I'm ready to do so. So I decided to play h3, which is a more modest move, trying to get him to be the one to weaken his king, which is exactly what he did. Emails asks, what if he goes e6 at any point, trying to take away the d5 pawn? This would be a sensible move, right? Because he's trying to undermine my knight from c6, right? He's trying to undermine the base of the knight. What would I have done if he goes e6? Can somebody tell me what would white do if he goes e6? Bishop takes d6 is correct. Yes, exactly. Bishop takes d6, and we just win everything. And that's something you have to just learn how to do as a matter of habit. Thank you, Ghost DLB, for the prime and horriplation. Which is that when your opponent moves a pawn, and his position is already very fragile to begin with, you need to sort of get into the habit of checking which pawns and pieces are left unattended as a consequence of that. It's the same exact thing that we did here, right? I'm like, okay, well, which squares have been made available to my pieces? I can get my knight to d4 and I can centralize it and bring it to an outpost. Innovative Panda asks, when black played g5, did sacrificing the knight to open up the king work? So we could have considered, yeah, so I could have done this, but I didn't see a need to do it, right? It's like, I'm already better. I've got positional advantages. Why risk it with a sacrifice, particularly since I don't have that many pieces in the attack? He can, sorry, I didn't mean to play that move. He can bring his own knight in. He can bring his bishop in. So I wasn't just sure that it was worth doing it in a position like this. I'm not really desperate, if that makes sense. And the last thing I wanted to draw your attention to is this moment, right? Why did we take with a pawn and not with a rook? Now, why would we have taken with a rook? Because here we can get both rooks to the c file. That would have also been good. But I judged that the fact that the bishop gets open, A, and B, how close the pawn is to promotion, and C, the fact that I'm now blocking his rook from coming to c8, crippling his pieces permanently, there's just too many pros versus to not play this. So it's just a judgment call. It's like there's no rocket science to the art of making a decision like this. I'm just weighing the pros and cons, right? Okay, here the rook is very good. That's one thing. But here I've got all sorts of things that are given to me. And the last thing I did, of course, was open up the position, open up the king side, because his pieces are so passive. That's basically our main principle. All right, so let's once again try to get a London system in. And this time he plays d6, so I suppose we can technically still play the London f5. Okay, so he transposes into a Dutch. And if you're a London player, then there's no particular way that you should respond differently to the Dutch. You should play the typical London system moves. And in the London, you develop your bishop to f4. I think most people probably have seen this opening before. Now, there's several things that we can do in order to respond, I think, accurately to the fact that our opponent is playing the Dutch. The move f5, if you think about it from a general perspective, it weakens this diagonal, right? It moves a pawn out, which means he's going to have a difficult time castling if and only if we do what? Where should we develop one of our pieces in order to delay and sort of try to slow down his development? Let's go bishop c4. So not only does this slow down castling, but it also makes it very hard. Well, it makes it harder for him to go e6. He manages to do it, but now we have in our pocket the idea of going knight g5. But let's not do that immediately. Let's complete our development. Let's be patient. That's what you do in the London system. h3 is also a very typical move, giving the bishop the h2 square. And now we need to start expanding on the queen side. So let's do that by playing c4. Very typical move in d4 openings. Aren't we blunting the bishop? I see some of you guys looking at this. Aren't we blunting our bishop? Well, we kind of are. But what I'm banking on is that eventually we're going to be able to play c5. We're going to reopen the diagonal for the bishop, and we're going to increase the queen side pawn pressure. We're going to turn the dial up on the queen side. Okay, so right now we're just developing, we're grabbing space, and of course he can castle. We can't permanently stop him from castling, but we're going to discourage it because he's always going to have to deal with this kind of pressure. Thank you, Zemius, for the prime and channel for the 100 bits. Okay, so okay, now let's see what happens here. All right. So let's see what happens here. He's deep in thought. I mean, I think he's, yeah, so he decides to castle. Now we're going to continue our development with knight to c3. And slowly but surely, we're going to prepare either the c5 pawn break, or we could also try to prepare the e4 pawn break in order to make it easier for us to attack the e6 pawn. He goes a6. That's kind of an empty move. Now, in the interest of preparing c5, what kind of move can we consider which may potentially help us prepare c5? And this is a very typical move in such positions. Again, you want to make sure that you're playing to take care of your future self. It's not all about immediate threats, because somebody might look at this move and say, well, wait a minute, you're not preparing c5 because there's the knight on c3. I know that, but we're doing it in the long run. And I'm going to share with you guys a very interesting plan in this position. What would make it easier for us to prepare c5, right? Well, wouldn't it be nice, ladies and gentlemen, to have a pawn on b4? I mean, then c5 would be much easier. Now, why can't we play b4? Well, there's a bishop on b3. And if we move the bishop to c2, well, we would get it off the main diagonal, and the bishop would miss the party, and we would blunder the c4 knight. So how do we solve this problem? We need to get this bishop to a different square. We can't get it to a2, but we can play a3, get the bishop back, and then send the pawn forward. And I'll show you guys an example from one of my games where I lost to a very similar idea, and I've learned this idea from that game, and I haven't forgotten it since. So this is a pretty deep positional idea, and it's going to make it very hard for him to stop c5. Even if he goes a5, it's still going to be hard for him to stop b4. So let's proceed with our plan. Okay. And guess what? We are ready to play c5 and finally to reopen this bishop on a2. So it's a long-term process. Oh, and he actually kind of helps us do it. He's trying to carve out the d5 square, but the d5 square is very well protected by our pieces. We shouldn't worry about him getting a knight there, precisely because the bishop and our knight are guarding that square. Okay, bishop c6. What should we do now? Paying very careful attention to the drawbacks of this move. And this is exactly why we tried to open up the bishop. It's working like a knife through butter. What can we do? What has he left unattended? Boom, goes the dynamite. We can just take on e6. Well, who said we can't take two pawns? Who said we can't take two free pawns? Okay, I'm not sure why this trade is helpful for him, but now we're attacking the rook. I'm very hungry. Okay. So how should we go about managing our massive position here? Obviously, we're dominating here, but a lot of people struggle with this moment, and understandably so. So one thing that I want to, one idea that I have, right? If you look at this king very carefully, he doesn't have a light-squared bishop. What does that mean? That means that if we build a battery with our bishop and our queen, he's going to have a very hard time stopping it because he's not going to be able to put a light-squared bishop in the face of our bishop. Now, you guys already know that if you think about queen-bishop batteries, the queen in front of the bishop is a lot more powerful because the queen could be the one delivering the mate. So let's bring our bishop back to b1. I'm not threatening queen e4. I know that square is defended, but it's the same exact principle as earlier. I'm anticipating that in the future we might try to get this knight out of f6, or what is the other thing we can do? We could just circumvent it. We could just bring the queen to c2. Then we could try to get rid of the knight, and then guess what? We're going to try to end this game by delivering a checkmate on h7. Look at his knight on a7, by the way. Fantastic piece. Okay, so why not queen d3? Doesn't matter. Either move is good. Queen d3, maybe he'll put a rook on d8 and x-ray the queen. So the queen is a long distance piece. All right, let's get the bishop up to e5. We are actually poised to take the knight on e5, but we don't need to do it yet. And this is something I want to emphasize to people. We don't need to hurry with something that's not going anywhere. Even if we don't get to take this knight, he's permanently weakened at the diagonal. Now, we have a really strong move here, which basically ends the game. We have several moves that basically end the game. One is, well, if we take on f6, he's going to take with the bishop, and his queen continues to defend the square on h7. So what we can do is go knight e4, and what we're threatening to do is take twice on f6. Eventually, his queen is going to have to recapture, and then the h7 square is free for our queen. He correctly goes queen to g7. Now, how can we add some Tabasco sauce to this knight on f6? Can we find a way to pressure that knight in another way? And there's no more pieces that can do that immediately, so we're going to have to open up some files. Let's add that Tabasco sauce. f4, we're trying to open. If he goes g4, then we can just take on g4. Remember, his queen is tied down to the h7 square. It cannot move anywhere. At the moment it moves, we are going to take on f6 with a knight, and we're going to travel with our queen to h7. Boom. And guess which square we're going to deliver? Boom. And that's it. He doesn't. Boom, boom, boom. And we're going to mate him on h7 exactly as we thought initially because, well, it's not a surprise. When we were building that battery, he already didn't have anything to stop us with. Okay, he's going to give up his rook, but that doesn't matter. Now he's down a rook, and he can't even take twice on f6 here either. Okay, we're going to bring that final rook into the game. Remember the key principle. Even when you're up material, don't forget to employ all of your pieces. Okay, and I hope you guys don't mind if I munch on some Armenian bread here. Okay, he resigns. So a nice game. Rook f8 was not force mate. Guys, if you got to be very careful with the sacrifices because the rook on e7 guards h7. And so this is not checkmate. And this is something I have shared with people. You might be watching my blitz games and assume, you want to sacrifice in every position. But sometimes if you're agonizing over whether to sacrifice, you got to realize you're up a rook. What's the necessity? What's the need in doing something that might backfire? So sometimes it's worth playing with an abundance of caution. What happened in this game? You ask questions now. This is the postmortem, the autopsy. We go over the game. I explain some of the decisions, and you guys can ask questions. I can't get to every question, but I can do my best. Okay, so the game started with a London system, bishop f4. He transposed from the Perk into the Dutch with f5. Thank you, Fire Dude, for the prime. I appreciate it. And I know a lot of people are fans of the London system, so I decided to play it. I got some YouTube comments requesting that. The London system is fine as a beginner. Now, bishop c4. So generally in the London, and I will explain this through the lens of d4, d5. Zyrony, thank you for the prime. The London is an opening where white goes bishop f4, and then generally establishes a stronghold on the d4 square. He puts pawns on e3 and d3, creating this pawn triangle. And then the bishop, the light-squared bishop, generally goes in the middle of the pawn triangle. But one thing that's very important to understand, when you're playing an opening, that's what I call a schematic opening, an opening where you play the same set of moves over and over again, you want to be very, very careful. Because sometimes your opponent does something which requires you to think outside the box and play a move which is normally not part of the opening setup. This is exactly that kind of case, right? Normally in the London, as I just explained, the bishop goes either to d3 or to e2. But this is an extenuating situation because he's played f5, he's weakened this diagonal, so now we dynamically react by developing the bishop to c4 and controlling this diagonal. I hope that makes sense. Okay, Wayne Rooney asks a great question. Why not d5? Well, yes, you're exactly right, Wayne Rooney. This creates a massive weakness on e5, which we can later occupy with a knight. And this is not the end-all, be-all for the bishop. We could go c4, and much like we did in the game, we can try to open that bishop back up. Okay, So knight b6, e6, and really the critical moment of the game. And by the way, the reason that h3 is often played in the London is because after knight h5, he will be unable to root out the bishop due to bishop h2. Okay, so Wolf and Water, thank you for the tier 1. And again, good evening to everybody. Those over 5,000 here, and those of you joining from Chess TV, welcome. It's an honor to have so many of you here for something that I know people enjoy, and I enjoy so much. So we're having a great time, and I hope you guys are having a good time as well. Just want to thank everybody for this massive support that I'm experiencing here. It's really amazing. So thank you all, Hashmi. Appreciate it. Okay. So this idea that I came up with of a3, bishop a2, and b4. And I feel like Mr. Bean explaining Whistler's mother here. What did I learn from this experience in Los Angeles? So let me show you guys the STEM game. Where did I learn about this idea? And hopefully this is going to convince people of the importance of learning from your own losses, no matter how painful they are. This is a position in which I was playing with the white pieces. I was playing a grandmaster from India, Abhijit Gupta, very strong player, 2600. And in this position, he played the move queen to b6. This is a French, right? You guys can understand why he played queen b6. 2 Dragon, thank you for the prime. He is exerting pressure on the d4 pawn. He's got now 3 defenders on the pawn. I've got 3 attackers on the pawn. I've got 2 defenders. So he is threatening to capture this pawn. And with this pawn comes the other pawn. This is just a very, very bad position. So what did I do? I played the move queen a4, and I'm saying, okay, well, you have 3 attackers. Now I have another defender. And my opponent did something here which I never forgot. He came up with a brilliant idea. Now, what my opponent asked himself here is which of white's 3 defenders constitutes the weak link? If he can remove one of these 3 defenders from the pawn, then this pawn will collapse. And when this pawn collapses, my whole position collapses. Now, generally speaking, paradoxically enough, as you guys know, the weakest link is the strongest piece because it is the easiest to attack. If you attack the queen normally has to move, which means that he paid attention to the queen. But it's not easy to get rid of this queen without also getting, well, you can drop your queen back and go knight b6. Congratulations. But you've also then removed an attacker on the d4 pawn. And as some of you guys are already pointing out, a6 was played. I did not understand this idea. King g2. First, he developed his bishop to e7 to defend g5. After trading rooks, boom, queen a7, dropping the queen back, and b5, sending my queen away. I already understood at this point what he wanted, but there was nothing I could do about it. And he wins the pawn, and he wins the pawn, and he won the game in another couple of moves. Both of my central pawns collapse, and the game is basically over. So a brilliant idea, and I think it was repeated several times. Now, if we go back to the speedrun, you guys can see the similarity in this idea. Now, my aim is different. I'm not trying to win a pawn. I'm trying to, organize in advance. But this concept of vacating a square and then pushing a pawn is exactly the same. We go c5. And immediately we open up the bishop and we reap the fruits of our labor instantly. He blunders the pawn, and another one, even if he didn't blunder it, we could have gone d5 or e4. I mean, he's under tremendous amount of pressure here. If he goes d5 here, what should white do? What should white do in this position? All right, knight e5 is fine, but also bishop takes c7. Again, remember when the pawn is pushed, particularly in the center, remember to check which pawns have been left behind. Take c7, and then we can put our knight on e5. Okay, so after that, the rest was very simple. This move bishop e1, I think is actually quite a strong one because we prepare, once again, that battery of the queen and the bishop. So boom, boom, he goes g5. He helps us out a little bit by bringing our bishop to the central square, where it can take the knight on demand. And now the move f4, right? Adding some Tabasco sauce. Holy Fire asks, is knight e4 good instead of building the bishop queen battery ASAP? Gets his knight out of the equation first. So let's check. So knight e4, yeah, that would have been fine. What I was a little bit concerned about here is the fact that my queen is on the same file as one of his rooks, which means that I have to watch for moves like g5. I know that that's not possible here, but you always have to play with this abundance of caution when possible, right? Sometimes that's not possible. But when you're winning, there's no need to play to live on the edge. If he goes g4 after f4, we take on g4. cannot capture with the knight. The knight is pinned. If he captures with the queen, he leaves the h7 square unattended, which means we can take on f6 and deliver that checkmate. So that's a key observation here, right? How do I know to look for something? Well, I can see that there's two pieces responsible for guarding h7, the knight and the queen. I can take the knight whenever I want to, so what I'm really going for here is something that would force his queen out of g7, and that's why I'm increasing the pressure on the knight on f6, because it's not the knight I'm trying to capture. I could have done that earlier. It's that I'm trying to get his queen out of the picture to deliver that checkmate, and that's exactly what I do here. If he would have taken the rook, I take with the bishop, and then, of course, I deliver checkmate on h7. Hopefully that makes sense. When are we generally allowed to move kingside pawns in the attack? Well, there's no formula here, right? It's a judgment call. But one of the things that you can do is ask yourself, does my opponent have enough pieces to counterattack my king if I open up the king side, right? And sometimes the answer is yes, but the importance of opening up the king side is such that you will allow that kind of risk, right? It's all about weighing the risk and the benefit of whatever it is you do. There's never really an algorithm past a certain level. There is when you're a beginner, but when you're 1700, you've got to make those judgment calls. There's no way to sort of, algorithmically reason your way into it. Okay, let's play one more, and then maybe I'll switch over to some blitz. Yeah, his pieces are tied down defending, so that's part of the reason why I allowed myself to open up the king side, right?